Hello, and welcome to another Village Torah portion discussion with me, your host, Rabbi Drew. This week's Torah portion is the parasha of Pinchas. Now, we know this Torah portion it's named after someone, and there's only like 6 or 7 different parashiot, different Torah portions throughout the entire year that are named after a particular person. Having discussed the end of last week's Torah portion, the incident that Pinchas becomes known for, especially at the very outset of this week's Torah portion, for which it is named, for whom after it is named, really, there are a lot of things actually that take place within this week's Torah portion, a lot to discuss. And since this is the third year of Village Torah on this Torah portion, in previous years, we have discussed Benot Tzlafchad, the daughters of Tzlafchad. How do we apportion land with someone who does not have sons, which previously only sons got land? What now about the daughters? We discussed that 2 years ago. Last year, I discussed the transition of leadership from Moses to Joshua. This year, I want to speak about something that really does not get a lot of discussion, not a lot of airtime, yet takes up 2 full chapters in this week's Torah portion. Now, I mentioned, in addition to discussing Pinchas and his elevation to becoming a Kohen, a priest, one thing we have not yet discussed, maybe next year, is the census that is taken for this Torah portion. I did discuss last year the transition of leadership from Moses to Joshua, and now I want to talk about something that we really don't ever discuss, and that is something, I will say, it is not something that even for people who regularly attend Shabbat morning services, regularly listen to even the Torah portion, I think many people don't usually really think about it. In fact, I might even be guilty of myself. Your eyes just sort of glaze over. Well, I wanted to discuss it, break it down, and even give a sort of a visual depiction of sorts of trying to understand it. Now, what I am talking about are offerings. That's right, offerings in the Torah. Now, we have seen various places, Book of Leviticus and elsewhere, where different animal offerings are offered at different times. But we have really at the end of this week's Torah portion, the final 2 chapters really focus on various times of year and the offerings given. And the basic structure is simply you offer an animal, and there's corresponding meal offerings and libation offerings to go along to accompany those animal offerings. So I figure, you know what, we'll just dive right into it. It's certainly not something that you'll find a lot discussed about. So actually, let me break it down. Really, I'm going to do something really as a preface, which is the basic orientation, which we get discussed in this week's Torah portion. It also happens in Numbers chapter 15. So earlier in the book of Numbers, we have a breakdown. Actually, it's an elongated breakdown, but I wanted to also mention it. The breakdown comes here. So we have here, and again, this is chapter 28. Chapters 28, 29 here are really where a lot of this action is taking place. So here in chapter 28, verses 7 through 8, we read, "The libation with it shall be a quarter of a hin for each lamb to be libated in the sacred precinct as an offering of beer to the Lord. The other lamb you shall offer at twilight, preparing the same meal offering and libation as in the morning, an offering by fire of pleasing odor to the Lord." So here on a daily basis, we have a morning offering and we have an evening offering, both times focusing on one lamb. Now, the lamb has an addition accompanying it, has a quarter of a hin. Now, a quarter of a hin is about 30 ounces. So we're talking about, and this is actually really fascinating and, believe it or not, a matter of debate amongst rabbis, scholars, and more as to what it was, but the term here expressed is beer. So now the shechar, this 30 ounces in the morning, 30 ounces in the evening, so 60 ounces in all roughly, is to be poured out accompanying this lamb. And there's also a similar amount of meal offering. Then for Shabbat, every week we have Shabbat, a burnt offering for every Sabbath, in addition to the regular burnt offering and its libation. So we have the structure every day, one lamb in the morning, one lamb in the evening, with a small amount of meal offering each time, and also about 30 ounces of beer to be poured out on the altar along with those. And then on Shabbat, doubling that. It really is an extra. It's just a little bit extra. Okay. But then it really ramps up. On your new moons, Rosh Chodesh, on new moons, you shall present a burnt offering to the Lord, 2 bulls of the herd, 1 ram, and 7 yearling lambs without blemish. As meal offering for each bull, 3/10 of a measure of choice flour with oil mixed in. As meal offering for each ram, 2/10 of a measure of choice flour with oil mixed in. As meal offering for each lamb, 1/10 of a measure of fine flour with oil mixed in. Such shall be the burnt offering of pleasing odor and offering by fire to the Lord. Their libation shall be 1/2 a hin of wine for a bull, 1/3 of a hin for a ram, and 1/4 of a hin for a lamb. That shall be the monthly burnt offering for each new moon of the year. And there shall be 1 goat as a sin offering to the Lord to be offered in addition to the regular burnt offering and its libation. One question, unclear. The Torah never really specifies how much this goat, how much libation and meal offering should accompany it. Do we consider it like a ram or more like a lamb? It might be more the latter, more to be considered like a lamb. So we can figure out the calculation for that. Now, we have the 1/4 of a hin is about 30.6 ounces, 1/3 of a hin, 40.8 ounces, and 1/2 a hin, 61.2 ounces, just to give us a sense. So certainly for the Rosh Chodesh, for the new moon, this happens roughly a dozen times a year, roughly. Sometimes we have leap years. We have 13 months. Okay, that happens, but roughly 12 times a year. Now we get into all the different holidays. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but we have this for Passover. You shall present an offering. We have all of these things, 2 bulls of the herd, 1 ram, 7 lambs, and everything that accompanies that, along with a goat for expiation on your behalf. Then we have Shavuot, which in the Bible was called Yom HaBikurim, the festive week, Shavuot Techem. We call Shavuot, so Shavuot, and it talks about everything. I could go on. I could keep showing you. You know what? I'm going to scroll through right now. And we'll see. That's all the rest of chapter 28. Chapter 29 talks about Rosh Hashanah. What do you offer on Rosh Hashanah? And then guess what? We have Yom Kippur, and then all the various offerings. And then we have Sukkot, and we have a lot being offered there. I will say, although there are some different, I will say, because I can sense that probably, I would imagine a lot of people's eyes would probably simply glaze over a lot of procedures, which right now we don't have a standing temple to offer these offerings, and yet it's still part of our tradition. So I will simply break it down. I'll save you a lot of going through this, but we have Rosh Chodesh is a similar amount as we offer on Passover, as in the second days, the end days of Passover, and similar for Shavuot. It's all very similar amount of offerings. Similarly, but not exactly the same, is a different model. A similar model, not exactly the same, is this model that we see for the fall holidays. So there's sort of one model for the spring holidays and a slightly modified model for the fall holidays, which I'll read the Rosh Hashanah one. In the 7th month, on the 1st day of the month, you shall observe a sacred occasion. You shall not work at your occupations. You shall observe it as a day when the horn is sounded. You shall present a burnt offering of pleasing odor to the Lord, 1 bull of the herd, 1 ram, and 7 yearling lambs without blemish. The meal offering with them, choice flour with oil mixed in, shall be 3/10 of a measure for a bull, 2/10 for a ram, and 1/10 for each of the 7 lambs. And there shall be 1 goat for a sin offering to make expiation on your behalf. Okay, all of these things. One note I should make is I mentioned at the outset the language associated with the daily and to some degree the Shabbat offerings is beer, but all the other libations are with wine. So that is one difference between the daily and the special. So that is always with wine, but a lot more. So I mentioned we have the spring set, where we're sort of the spring model, where we have Rosh Chodesh, we have Passover first day, Passover last day, and Shavuot is one model, which I'll share with you momentarily. And then we have this fall holiday model, which is Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and then we have Shmini Atzeret. And there is one whole set of holidays that we haven't even touched, and that's going to be wildly different, which is the holiday of Sukkot. It is a vastly different model. Now, what I'm going to show you as far as a graph that I put together, that I think is helpful. It's a helpful representation for showing how similarly or different these various offerings would amount to on these different times. Now, what I've done is focused on the libation aspects. I mean, really, because I think it's utterly fascinating how much wine God is supposed to drink that we're offering to him. But I think it's also helpful, rather than showing all the different animals, this is a representation, especially since the meal offerings are going to similarly correspond with the libation volume. Here I have a lovely chart that I put together for our Torah portion. Now, there are a couple of things in here that mention some Leviticus libation aspects, which is true. We get a little bit in chapter 23 where in Leviticus, where there's also a whole set of holidays, and once or twice some references to libation. But for the most part, everything is right here in our Torah portion in chapters 28 and 29. And as you can see, we have the daily libations here. And this is, as I should note, is with beer. Okay, so this with beer. Shabbat is a similar number, pretty small when we're talking about volume. Again, this is about a quarter of I mean, really, you're doubling it. So it's not just a quarter of a hin, so it's a half hin total, right? So we're talking 61 ounces of beer to be libated on a daily basis, and then another 60 on Shabbat. So we're talking about almost a full gallon, really, of beer to be libated on Shabbat. But there's a huge jump up, as you can see, when we get to the Rosh Chodesh, new moon. When we get to the new moon, the Passover, and that's all 7 days of Passover. All 7 days of Passover and Shavuot. So we have this model where we have, it's not exactly 3 hins, but it's rough. It's in that ballpark. So this is a lot more. It's a significant jump up here from about a gallon on Shabbat total, or about half gallon, a little less than a half gallon on a regular daily basis, to a lot more, a lot more indeed. So we have, if we want to say a lot more, so we have on, let's say, Rosh Chodesh, a new moon, we're now also pouring out libating to God. We're more than probably about 2.5 gallons, really 2.5 gallons of wine, just pouring out libating to God. And that's, like I mentioned, Rosh Chodesh, this new moon, each and every single 7 days of Passover, and also Shavuot. So that's a pretty high level. Then we get to slightly less when it comes to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and also a very exact same amount for, we have Shmini Atzeret, that's the 8th day. We have Sukkot, which is 7 days, and then that 8th day, that final day, sort of to end it all. But that's a similar fall model. Now, I mentioned this fall set is a little bit smaller because there's one less animal to be offered for those days than in the spring. And so therefore, correspondingly, amount of wine to be libated is also less. But we're still talking 2.5 gallons or so, roughly, give or take. But certainly the ballpark of 3 biblical hins. But no one can look at this chart and miss what is going on here with Sukkot. This is vast amounts to be, first of all, just offered. We have a lot of bowls being offered, and the only difference from one day to the next, to the next, to the next is one less bowl. So now when it comes to Sukkot, this is pretty massive. On the graph, on this chart that I have shared with you, it is very clearly evident this is markedly different than any other time of the year. Now, I want to dip back down into the text. It's in this week's Torah portion, after all. And here's what it has. On the 15th day of the 7th month, you shall observe a sacred occasion. You shall not work at your occupations. 7 days you shall observe a festival of the Lord. You shall present a burnt offering, an offering by fire of pleasing odor to the Lord, 13 bulls of the herd, 2 rams, 14 yearly lambs. They shall be without blemish. The meal, okay. And then it has all the corresponding amounts that we've read before. And then the second day, 12 bulls and 14 yearly lambs, 2 rams. So we see that what will happen is this consistent decreasing, resulting in this tapered amount to be offered. So everything, the same amount of rams, the same amount of lambs, just one less bowl for every single day of Sukkot, of these 7 days of Sukkot. So we have a lot, first of all, just from the animals amount. This is a lot of animals, certainly markedly different from the rest of the year at any point in the year, any even holiday amount of animals. And there's also this corresponding amount, resulting in, as you can see, for the first 2 days, there are over 10 heens being offered. I mean, if we're talking, if a heen is roughly 122, 123 ounces, so we're talking 10 times that. We're talking over 1,000 ounces being libated. So as you can imagine, that's a lot, over 1,000 ounces. So that's more than 8 gallons being libated on each of these first 2 days of Sukkot. More than 8 gallons of wine just libated out to God. Now, there's also lots of animals. Now, every single day, I mentioned there's a decrease. There is a tapering down. Ultimately, by the 7th and final day, there are now fewer than 8 biblical heens being libated. But still, this is a massive, even this final day is still more than double than the most on any other holiday of the rest of the year, even Rosh Chodesh, Passover, or Shavuot. So this is certainly a lot. A lot is going on. I don't know about you. I had never seen anybody put together a graph like this for these 2 chapters in this week's Torah portion. I am a visual learner. Yes, reading is helpful, but a graph like this, I don't know about you, but for me, it was incredibly instrumental in helping me grasp just how massive we're talking about of a celebration there is going on with the animal sacrifices, the meal offerings, and the graph that I presented here is the libation amounts being offered on all of these days. Of course, we have Sukkot, which just really utterly stands out, but even the rest of the holidays, and to see how that system is set up. Ultimately, what it comes down to, you might say, okay, Rabbi Drew, this is really neat and all about all of these offerings that we have taking up 2 chapters of our Torah portion, but so what? Now, that's true. That's fair. It's definitely a fair question. For me, first of all, what do you do with all of this? Now, I think in a very basic sense, I think that just as we are created in the image of God, that means that God is somehow reflective of us. And just as we eat and drink, and like a happy meal that you might find at a fast food restaurant where you will have a protein, right? A meat, you will have starches that go along with that, and a drink. This is kind of like the biblical happy meal that just because we're eating doesn't mean that God should not also eat and drink. So that's what's going on here. This is for God. We have the daily offerings for him to eat. We have the food, we have the meat, we have the drink, we have the meal offerings. And then at these various appointed times, Rosh Chodesh, Pesach, Shavuot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Shemini Atzer, all of these are much more massive than even a Shabbat. And then on top of that, Sukkot is utterly massive, more than double than any of the rest of the special days of the year for all of these offerings. Yes, it's really fascinating. The rabbis talk about in the Mishnah, much later, after already the destruction of the temple, the second temple, they said anybody who has never seen this, they called it the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, but basically, although it's a reference to a particular instance during the holiday of Sukkot, as you can tell, this was a massive gathering time, Sukkot. It was a massive time of happiness, of celebration, of simcha. Largely, of course, it was a harvest time. The harvest for the year is largely done by this point. So everything's over with. You can bring things, you can celebrate, you can offer, but still it helps put into our minds a sense of how much is going on throughout the course of the year, sort of the flow of it, and certainly to highlight how special and happy Sukkot is. One other thing, for those who find themselves praying, we do have a prayer. It's called Musaf, the Musaf prayer. So the regular way that we have prayers that they're set up, we have Shacharit, it's in the morning. We have Mincha, it's in the afternoon. And we have Ma'ariv in the evening or nighttime. So those are the 3 daily prayers. But on all Shabbats and Rosh Chodesh and all of these holidays, we also have an additional service, which is called Musaf, which translates to additional because it's extra, it's special for that day. Every single Musaf that we have year round, doesn't matter, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Passover, doesn't matter. All of these dates, they have a Musaf. And every single Musaf also has mention of the offerings, the animals, the meal offerings, and the libations. Has all of these. So even when we're praying, all of these special dates of the year, we can read the words, we can say the words. But this, hopefully, with this visualization, gives us a better sense when we are praying on Shabbat, on Rosh Chodesh, on Yom Kippur, what the words that we are saying. I'm not saying the whole prayer, but at least for the snippet of the prayer that we discussed these offerings, hopefully this gives us a little bit of a better sense than just reading through these words in chapters 28 and 29 in this week's Torah portion, at least giving us a sense, a grasp of how much on a daily basis or even on a special basis, what we're talking about. So I hope that was helpful. Certainly not a common topic that we would normally discuss, especially it's offering based. We don't have a temple. We haven't had one in many centuries that's standing that we can offer offerings with. But one day, hopefully we'll have that third temple rebuilt and we can offer these things. But in the meantime, it certainly gives us an insight, A, into this week's Torah portion, and B, also into our Musaf prayer. So I hope this was helpful. And before we go, all Jewish life and programming here at Majestic Care at Cedar Village are due to the financial support from Jewish Home of Cincinnati. Thank you. And before we go, now I want to say thank you so much for watching, and Shabbat Shalom.